I can summarize the basic picture, which is my knowledge of Christian O'Brien, who is the real genius behind my work and the man who inspired me. He married my mother's first cousin, Barbara Joy O'Brien, and he was an exploration geologist, and he was a Cambridge scholar, and also he received CBE for his work reaching the situation of being the head of the oil industry in Iran. That's all the companies in the world who were dealing with the Shah when the Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry. And when he first met my Uncle Pat, who in fact was my godfather, Barbara Joy's husband, Uncle Pat said, "Well, what do you do, young man?" And he said, "Well, I've just been working out how far the Rocky Mountains have moved in the last 65 million years." And he had. And so he was incredibly clever in a practical sense, which so many academics aren't. And he had his first job in 1935 when he joined a French archaeologist called Beaulieu, who was working for the oil industry. And Beaulieu took him across the plains of Mesopotamia, and they stopped for the night at a very large mound. And Beaulieu took him up to the top of the mound as the sun was setting, and they could both see field systems from this mound right the way to the Zagros Mountains, across miles of flat desert then. And on top of the mound were clay tablets, inscribed clay tablets. And having come from Cambridge, traveling across the Lebanon and working for the oil companies, he decided that when he retired, he would find out what the tablets said. So, having reached the top of his profession, he couldn't have gotten any higher. His team discovered oil in Libya. They rewrote the geology of the Rocky Mountains, finding oil in various parts of the Rocky Mountains. And so he was a very high-powered executive in the oil industry, reaching the top of his profession. And he took retirement in 1970 and moved to Withington in Essex with Barbara Joy. And one of his first projects was to survey a line of stones from Wandlebury to Hatfield Forest. And having done a detailed survey, which he was a specialist, he found that that line of stones wasn't straight. It was curved. And it was curved because it was built as a loxodrome. It was built as a curve to make allowance for the curvature of the earth. And so he suddenly realized that this loxodrome from Hatfield Forest to Wandlebury was built 2,500 BC, and that the people then were constructing a perfect astronomical means by which to survey the planets and the stars. Following that discovery, he then went to Bodmin Moor and found and identified, formerly being some 90 stone cairns. Some of them are still there. I've been down to Bodmin myself and looked at them. Most of them have been plundered for stones for the farm walls, etc. But he identified with his calculations and skill an observation observatory of the highest quality on Bodmin Moor. And it's believed, I believe, that that was 2,500 BC, O'Brien dated it then, and I believe that that may well have been the Druids, with their skills, letting the Egyptians know that we were likely to have another major impact, which we did round about 2300. and it's all there to see, it's all there to measure and check, but we find that there aren't many archaeologists of the normal sense who have the kinds of skill and brains and abilities of somebody like Christian O'Brien. So they've been very keen to dismiss him and to be very rude about his work. Anyway, my key contact, was when I was studying early agriculture. I wanted to know who were the people who started agriculture, because I knew, being a student of agriculture, that it was quite important. And so I rang him up one day and said, "What do you know about the early farmers?" And of course he knew everything. And he said, "Come and see me, love to see you," you know. And I went to Withington in North Essex, and we never looked back. And I learned other things, and particularly his work on the path of light and some of these extraordinary religious issues which are only just being revealed. And the path of light is a part of that, which he translated and brought it up to date so people could understand it. And that's now caused a very big fuss, if you like, in America. I've been on radio shows in America, and people feel that the path of light and the O'Brien knowledge totally rewrites our religious history. And I, having picked up the bits and pieces from O'Brien, wanted to look a lot further on subjects which he hadn't done. And so I've been pursuing a whole range of subjects, and on the YouTube you can find, there will be a total of about 24 YouTube presentations on various subjects connected with what we're talking about. And I've got a few more up my sleeve if I live long enough. And thanks to Christian O'Brien.
What do you call those?
They're all called Learning from History, and various titles, and they're on YouTube, and the radio shows as well. And of course, having made contact with Christian O'Brien on finding out the origins of agriculture, in which he was as well versed as anybody on the planet, set me on my particular path, which is adding to his work on the origins of agriculture, and simply spending all these years, which now run from 1997 until today, 2021, and I've spent very much of my time looking at all the connected issues. History is the only true philosophy and the only true psychology. And that's what I've done. I love doing it. I've learnt so much, and I hope other people will benefit from the legacy of Christian O'Brien and other incredible people who have searched for the truth. Truth before the world was the Druid motto, and I believe that that message is absolutely essential in this modern age to understand the truth about our past. Cataclysms and the Restart of Civilization, revealing the origin of agriculture and purpose of the pyramids. The two books which are important are by these authors, Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien. Search for the Gods, the Master Builders, and the Advanced Civilization of the Anunnaki. And here we have the Genius of the Few. The next image is the site of the Garden of Eden below Mount Hermon. Atlantis, which is detailed in chapter 18 of the masterwork, which is called The Shining Ones. The first stage of the O'Brien research, discovering ancient observational astronomy and advanced surveying skills in Britain before 2500 BC. The sky and the earth were mapped and measured. The Line A Loxodrome, knowledge of the Earth's dimensions, and the Bodmin Astronomical Observatory to train young druids from all over Europe. The earlier book was called The Megalithic Odyssey, which started the whole operation to run forward in revealing so much information about the master builders who were tramping the fields of Britain as early as 8000 BC. Now, further free detailed information is provided on the website www.goldenageproject.org.uk, linked to the Learning from History presentations, which now amount to over 3,000 slides, together with links to radio shows where the range of subjects are discussed. Ask your local bookshop to supply the books if you're outside the UK. The principal fact to support the existence of and to date the structures of our brilliant ancestors. This is the most basic, important fact about going back in history to 9,500 BC and beyond. Our ancestors delivered to us a standard unit of measurement. This is called the golden ratio, the Riemann measuration triangle, or rectangle, sorry. Now we have within that a Riemann, a royal cubit and a megalithic yard. You can look at these in your own time just to see what was involved. Now the standard measuring rod, the ruler, is held in the hand of, and both a tape held in the right hand of the king. And the measuring tape regards the measurement of 11 fields. So a list of 11 fields or estates with the measurements and statistics. The reign of Bursin, king of Ur, about 2,500 BC. Now this is from The Genius of the Few, page 357, Appendix G. And what we find is that these Riemann, royal cubit and megalithic yards, standard used measurements from the 9th century, we can see how there are slight variations from the Jericho buildings right the way through to the South American buildings. And we can see a very, very slight variation, which allows us to date them accurately. Quite extraordinary. A world dominated by craft, trades and skills for men and women. An important law in early Sumer, where over 200 craft, trades and skills were recorded in cities like Mari, founded circa 4500 BC, was that men and women craftsmen of one category should not tell another in a different trade what to do. For example, a stonemason could not tell a carpenter what to do, and the carpenter could not tell a stonemason what to do, in order to preserve the vital functions passed down within those skills over time. This is Professor Charles Hapgood, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. In this fascinating and provocative book, Charles Hapgood uses ancient maps as evidence for the existence, many thousand years ago, of an advanced worldwide civilization. Very important. Now, the human race and the vital traditions and professions which have been the primary victims of past cataclysms. Here we have the 160,000-year-old skull found in Ethiopia, the oldest known modern human fossil, with the skull slightly larger than those of modern-day humans. Scientists have classified it as a subspecies, Homo sapiens idaltu. On the right, an artist's reconstruction of an adult male. A key point in our genetics: we are all Africans. The Times, November the 17th, 2000. 3 boys and their common Y chromosome inheritance. They share a common ancestor of about 50,000 years ago, and this is shown by the male 158 marker, which is in the blood of all 3. The characteristics which we associate with race, such as skin color account for no more than a tenth of the variations between humans, which is 0.01 of our genetic makeup. The words Aryan and Semitic applied to different races was a product of late 19th century academic misconduct. Boscott man. Archaeologists have been at a loss to give a realistic explanation for the implied properties of the skull. It just does not fit in the accepted theories of evolution. It's held here by Professor Peter Wagener, which is a wonderful professor from South Africa, and who sadly recently died some 3 weeks ago. Long-headed and round-headed people, craftsmen and teachers at Bellisnap on the British Cotswolds, and later at the building of the Great Pyramid, seem to be long-headed as opposed to round-headed. Kennewick man, found on the Columbia River, lived round about 7,200 BC and was not an American Indian. The mounds of the United States after Cyrus Thomas, round about 4000 BC, from The Children of the Sun by W.J. Perry, a great archaeologist. The haplotype X European genetic marker has been dated to being in America by 30,000 BC. Here we have an image of the Kayapo chief Kanhok in his manioc garden on the edge of Goatá village and the Amazon, working with the forest. Like all farmers these days, scratching his head, wondering where he's going to go and what he's going to do. Here we have the most interesting evidence of the highest quality flints, Silatrine flint implements. These flint knapping skills were never improved upon, and this technology from France and Spain, round about 23,000 BC, reached the Clovis peoples of America by sea. And those Silatrine people, rather like the Eskimos, used walrus skin. Walruses came down as far as Gibraltar, and walrus skin was an absolutely wonderful material to make superior boats, better than the modern aluminium ones. And the Silatrine global navigators, who turned it upside down on a low wall of snow or stones to provide shelter in extreme weather conditions, plus a roof flap to allow the smoke out. Robust, vigorous, warm with life, a bison from Altamira, Spain, cave painting 20,000 BC. Over 50 different pigments were used throughout the cave painting period from around 32,000 BC, horses being the most popular subject. Now this is the Nazca reticulate cave spider, and it carries its reproductive organ at the end of its long leg, which requires a microscope to see it. At Catalhayak, 6,500 BC, fruit fly chromosomes were drawn on the walls, and this is in Christian O'Brien's Shining Ones. So how did they? They must have had microscopes in those days to actually be able to identify these fruit fly chromosomes. Knowledge of black holes before 1400 BC. This is the letter which was published by the Daily Mail on the 27th of February, July 2004. I have reproduced below an extract from what are commonly known as the Urugrit or Rashomara cuneiform tablets, which date before 1400 BC. It is from one of the series of 10 letters from one having responsibility in the Sarman Brotherhood to the Prince of the Land of the Four Directions at the Royal School of Urugrit, being an aspirant to the Brotherhood. This item relates to instructions on astronomy from a tutor to the pupil at a superb pre-Christian university on the Syrian coast north of Tyre and Sidon. And it says, "We are told that the stars without number we see in the heavens, each one of progeny, the inhabitants of heaven, will in their turn populate the heavens to time without end. So the story goes, that when the sun or star dies, it goes forth in a piercing flash of light after compressing upon itself until it press no more, and flies apart in a myriad of particles, each part finding itself a space wherein it can gather from the heavenly soil nourishment for its growth, and in due course make itself a world as our Lord Shamash has done." And that's from a very important book called The Phoenician Letters by Wilfred Davis and G. Zur. At the land of Canaan, we're looking here 1850 BC, a present from Pharaoh Amenhotep II, and it's in the National Museum of Beirut. And it's obsidian and gold. That is the Bush Barrow lozenge and the Clarendon plate. And I've come back to Britain to just demonstrate the sophistication of the people who lived at Stonehenge. The gold Bush Barrow lozenge on the left was discovered near Stonehenge in 1908. Measuring 7 inches tall, it lay across the chest of a skeleton of a tall man. The ninefold geometry produces acute angles which define the range of sunrises at the latitude of Stonehenge, while the obtuse angles match the extreme rising and settings of the moon. The Clarendon gold plate, found near Dorchester, appears to provide the same information, but at a more southerly latitude. That is a sophistication of the astronomical skills of the Druids. And what we now know about our universe and the history of our planet, which helps to provide a background to understanding explanations from the earliest records of the Sumerians, biblical texts, the Book of Enoch, and other religious and tribal sources. That's our home. This artist's impression of the Milky Way galaxy is based on the latest astronomy and shows the suburban location of the sun and its planets. Our sun jumps and dives through the spirals of cosmic radiation, completing a revolution around the galactic center in 28 million years. Now the sun jumps and dives through the midplane of the galaxy, and this is from Hans Fenmark and Nigel Calder, The Chilling Stars, most important research in the last 30 years on climate research from a Danish space agency. And we can see here that we have weaker cosmic rays, the Earth is warmer, stronger cosmic rays, the Earth is cooler, and back again to weaker cosmic rays, the Earth is warmer. Past wobbles in the climate linked to the motion of the sun can help to improve astronomical knowledge about the galaxy. Now the left-hand image, these conditions in our Milky Way galaxy with enough cosmic rays to make it freeze over, and that is known as snowball Earth. On the right image, we've got Earth under fire. This image shows the eruptions from the surface of the sun, the solar wind, and the magnetic positive sun and negative Earth relationships. The Earth's magnetic field provides protection from solar and cosmic radiation, but reverses every 11,500 years. Variations in solar activity. The sun puts out the same amount of energy in 25 millionths of a second as mankind has done over its entire 100,000 years of existence. from the first campfires to the Industrial Revolution. At the annual meeting of the professors of Bradford University last week, that's November 2007, a leading professor of applied mathematics and a world authority on solar physics stated that a large body of suppressed scientific evidence shows that several of the other planets in the solar system, including the gas giant Jupiter, are warming at almost exactly the same relative rate as Earth. It is not unreasonable to suggest that the Sun may be driving this, and the Little Ice Age coincided directly with the Maunder minimum when the Sun was very inactive for 200 years. Now the Sun, having entered a period of higher activity than any in the last 40 million years, now, that's January 20, entered the forecasted solar minimum with a prospect of colder conditions similar to the Maunder minimum, with rainfall favouring northwest Sahara, southern North America and other desert areas in the world. That should be an answer to all the critics who say that humans are warming the planet. So back to base, that's us. Now the rate of temperature change over 100-year intervals from 47,927 BC to the present day. Conditions for agriculture were hostile until the end of the great Younger Dryas Ice Age in 9,500 BC. Specialists consider that these conditions would have prevented agriculture as we know it today. Past and future climate change from David Archibald. Please note no man-made hockey stick illusion. Man-made CO2 represents much less than 4% of that created by natural processes. And as we return to a cooler cyclical phase, we will need more CO2. And there on this chart you can see the end of the last glacial, extreme cold. And then we go into the Holocene climatic optimums, the Floman climatic optimum, a medieval warm period, and then we have the Little Ice Age. And so we have these cycles within the temperatures and no sign of the so-called hockey stick. Instrumentally measured changes in global temperature for 1861 to 10,000, the thin line, fitted with a cyclic model trend of period 64 years, which is the bold line, with error bars for 2000 and 2030. Projection of climatic cycling in the 21st century indicates a predicted cooling trend. The big event. 3 stages of a supernova explosion impact. The first in 39,000 BC. The cosmogenic isotope data are all consistent with the following. First, 39,000 BC, a supernova exploded about 200 light years, that's 60 parsecs, from Earth, bathing the Australian side of the Earth in cosmic radiation, increasing global radiocarbon by 150%, giving rise to the extinction of large mammals. Very large camels, very large kangaroos. Second, about 7,000 years later, 32,000 BC, another event increased global radiocarbon substantially again. The second event most likely involved the arrival of high-velocity isotope-rich material ejected from the supernova. Third, in 10,850 BC, when after a period of warmer weather after the end of the Ice Age, the last major event occurred, bringing yet more radiocarbon to Earth, with most of the supernova debris wave passing the Earth and impacting the Earth. The arrival time of this event is consistent with the shock speed of a supernova remnant, which we would expect to be moving faster than 2 million miles per second. All 3 events from the supernova correspond well with the evidence in geological record of Earth. However, the Earth was tipped on its axis by 14 degrees. Now this is from The Cycle of Cosmic Catastrophes by Richard Firestone, Alan West and Simon Warwick Smith. This led to the intense Younger Dryas Ice Age, with 40% of the Earth's surface frozen, ending around 9,500 BC. Göbekli Tepe became a refuge for the angels and watchers before they were able to go to Karsak, an enclosure below Mount Hermon, and Jericho at the southern end of the Levantine corridor. So we have, to sum that up, cometary debris from the supernova explosion in 39,000 BC enters our planetary system in 10,850 BC. And these are tribal histories. Arawak, Caribbean tribe, warning of fire from the sky. The same story is told within many tribal histories. And appearing to them one day, the Creator told them, "Go dig a large pit, cover it with logs, pass sand over the top. After it is done, seal yourself inside the pit for protection." A similar story. And at the bottom here we have some animals and a few other people survived to rebuild the world. And what is interesting here from this book and these quotes are that the Creator told them, go dig a large pit. So they were the advanced people able to forecast this event and tell the local tribesmen to take cover. There we have an image of cometary debris. And this is a schematic diagram of the path apparently taken by Phaeton Marduk through the solar system based on the Sumerian texts. And this is brilliant work on the book called Catastrophe by Derek Allen and Bernard Dallaire. So we have this object, spewing fire, approaching the solar system. Pluto is pulled onto a new orbit. Uranus, pieces torn off Marduk here, equatorial alignment changed, the moon's deranged. And then Chiron, rotating and moved away from Saturn. And then we have Tiamat with direct hit and broken up. And then Mars, orbit changed, collects 2 moons. And then we have the Earth, and Venus is then put into a reverse spin, and then we have Mercury. So we have the extraordinary disruption of our solar system because of this massive object passing through our solar system. Now, the northern hemisphere glaciations during the last ice age, 3 to 4 kilometer thick ice sheets caused a sea level lowering of about 120 meters. The major impact of long-term ice melt water discharges encouraged survivors to live well above sea level at many locations, moving to higher land. And here we can see the more or less the center of the North Pole, which was very seriously affected. Footprints of cometary debris and axis shift at the end of the Ice Age warming and beginning of the Younger Dryas extreme cold between 10,850 and 9,500 BC. And here we have the craters, the California Bay craters, California Bays as they're called, which is a remnant of this mass debris. Dismal Bay, another feature of a large impact. And one of the proofs of this research is tracing radioactive earth by looking at and recording thorium. And the thorium print is very clearly made there, which confirms this large impact on the site of the old Hudson Bay. And these are possible polar flight paths of disintegrating aerial objects, theoretically responsible for the orientated lakes, Carolina Bays, and alleged crater on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. at the time of the Phaeton disaster, partially based on Kelly and Dashell. And that's from this book again, Catastrophe, by Derek Allen and Bernard Dallaire. Now, the recent ice cap was displaced from the current North Pole after axis shift. The Earth was moved on its axis by 14 degrees. And there is a clearer view of the European ice sheet. And this is from The Axis Shift That Sunk Atlantis by John Gagnon. General outline of the old northern landmass of Appalachia, Beringa and Fennoscandia, which submerged at the same time as the impact, 10,850. Again by Allen and Dallaire. Now this is a tentative reconstruction of the pre-catastrophic Pleistocene world before the catastrophe at 10,850 BC. Again, Derek Allen and Bernard Dallaire. And you can see on this map what the world maps would have looked like at this time. And the important items are the area of the Sahara was a large sea. We have land between South Africa and South America. We have land in the middle of the Pacific. And we have Lemuria in the area of Madagascar and India. And we can see the massive movements in the shape of the land surface at this time. One small point I'd like to raise is that if you look between the African continent and the Azores, you will see that it's possible, or would have been possible, for elephants to have traveled between Africa and the Azores, confirming Plato's record of elephants being in Atlantis. Now, Enoch mentions the earth tilting on its axis, during which the earth labours and is violently shaken. Now, Enoch is one of the most reliable historians who gives us great details about the Shining Ones. This event led to axis shift by 14 degrees, massive flooding, with debris filling caves in the southeast direction from the main Hudson Bay impact crater. Loss of atmosphere and the eventual demise of a large island on the site of the Azores by crustal rift faulting. In constructing the Great Pyramid, our ancestors left for us their mathematically perfect representation of the Northern Hemisphere, complete with the King's and Queen chamber star shafts. These star shafts record the position of the key North Alpha Draconis and South Zeta Orionis stars before and after the 10-kilometer comet hit the area of thick former North Pole ice over Hudson Bay at a velocity and a low angle trajectory sufficient to move the Earth on its axis by 14 degrees. It's interesting to note that Enoch's book was removed by St. Jerome in round about 390 AD. These shafts in the Great Pyramid record the positions of the key North Alpha Draconis and South Zeta Orionis stars before and after a 10-kilometer comet and other debris hit the area of thick former North Pole ice over the Hudson Bay at a velocity and low angle trajectory sufficient to move its Earth on its axis by 14 degrees, 10,850. And this is by John Gagnon, a brilliant researcher, from the axis shift that sank Atlantis. Southampton University oceanographic chart of the Azores, and you can see very clearly recent fractures in the Earth's crust. And this is the island of Atlantis as surveyed by Christian O'Brien, Chapter 18, The Shining Ones. Survey details and supporting evidence on www.goldenageproject.org.uk. Atlantis was real. It's still there, deep under the water, on the mid-Atlantic ridge. And we're told that it was almost certainly somewhere near the size of Spain. Now I'm moving to Göbekli Tepe for various interesting reasons, not least of which is the Younger Dryas refuge for the people of the god An, the angels and watchers. Summary of findings. This is Göbekli Tepe. Temporary home for the angels and watchers during the coldest period of the Younger Dryas Ice Age, between 10,850 BC and 9,500 BC, before they were able to disperse into the warm and dry Levantine corridor. The main structures are substantial quarried stone roof supports designed to carry a solid timber roof capable of supporting layers of organic and inorganic insulating material, mainly in the form of earth and stone, together with significant accumulations of snow. The timber has now decomposed, resulting in the collapse of the roofs, giving the impression that it may have been deliberately filled in. Many of the design features, including astronomical alignments, thick double walling, tunnel access, carvings of local animals, together with features such as sacred baskets associated with the pollination of plants, as seen in the Assyrian in the British Museum and around the world at early historical sites. There is no evidence of temples. And there we have the site of Göbekli Tepe marked by that red square. Sited on top of a hill at 2,200 feet, the settlement could benefit from the warmth of the sun and see below into the valleys for migrating animals, which provided their main hunter-gatherer diet. Structures gave shelter both from above and the sides, from the light cometary debris impacts and radiation, and had polished lime floors. We're going to come back to how important lime is at Jericho. A lovely reconstruction. So you can see somebody went to a great deal of trouble to go have a building where they could go and take cover. And this is some of the sophistication at Göbekli Tepe, round about 10,500. Pillar 43 with reliefs of vultures, scorpion, and the decapitated human form in the extreme lower right-hand corner. Now this revealed several adjacent rectangular rooms with floors of polished lime, reminiscent of Roman terrazzo floors, the most recent layer consisting of sediment deposited as a result of erosion and agricultural activity. And this is the sacred basket, which has puzzled many, many people. But you can see we have the figure of an angel holding a basket, and what he's doing is pollinating plants. At this point in time, when the atmosphere had been stripped, so to speak, we wouldn't have had many pollinating insects, we wouldn't have had bees, so the pollination had to be done manually, in other words, by hand. Common carved features are repeated all around the world, Easter Island, Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia, and you can see that style and the way these are carved is typical of our ancestors, the watchers. Now Sirius was the primary brightest star used for navigation by those who sailed from the Mediterranean and in the Pacific, and very importantly for calculating the exact length of the year. Skara Brae Orkney, very similar structure, great protection from cold weather, etc. And this was almost certainly what I would call a processing plant for walrus skins, bones, tusks, and a major industry until all the walrus had been killed and harvested and moved back towards the Arctic. We go to Malta, around about 3,600 BC, and we can see a similar structure, massive walls protecting the sides of these buildings, and clearly very substantial roofs. And even more so here, we find a model of corbelled roof structure and thick walls of protection on Malta, built by the Tuatha De Danann. And the Tuatha De Danann were the people of the god An. Fortified farming settlement quite a lot later at La Mancha, 2000 BC, similar, or it may be wrong date, they may have dated it the wrong date. The great tendency is not to put things looking too old with our scientists. Similar to the double wall broch built by the early Picts in northern England. Now the plans of all the main ancient administrative structures on the Maltese Islands in scale with one another and all orientated to the north. Wonderful book, From Malta Before History. Karsag, which means head enclosure, or better known as the Garden of Eden. And what led Christian O'Brien to his ability to translate the early Sumerian is very, very important. Now, to judge from the script, the Nippur cylinder illustrated on this plate from a Nippur collection at the University Museum, that's Pennsylvania, may date as early as 2,500 BC. It certainly actually dates to much earlier than that. Although copied and published by the late George Barton as early as 1918, its contents, which centre about the Sumerian air god Enlil and the goddess Ninhursag, are still largely unintelligible. Nevertheless, much that was known or misunderstood at the time of its publication is now gradually becoming clarified, and there is good reason to hope that the not too distant future will see the better part of its contents ready for translation. Now this was in 1965, and Christian O'Brien started work on translating these Sumerian cylinders in 1970 when he retired from the oil industry. And what he discovered there were 9 tablets from the Nippur library, and these are O'Brien translations. 1. The decision to settle, the arrival of the Anunnaki, the romance of Enlil and Ninil, the planning of the cultivation, the building of the settlement, the great house of Enlil, the cold winter storm, the 1,000-year storm, the destruction of Karsag. Text and museum numbers are available on Learning History Part 10 and on www.goldenageproject.org.uk. Here is the message which O'Brien was able to properly translate. And this is cylinder seal VA 243, which resides in the Berlin Museum. And it's Enlil holding the plough. I don't think the archaeologists realised that that was a plough, but it's very clear, and agriculture being the primary requirement to feed people at that early age. Levantine corridor, Syria and Lebanon to the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. Heaven, which is called Hashemin, translates as the planted highlands. The root in there is Shem in the middle, seed, clue to location. Snow-capped Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains up to 9,800 feet, divided by the Bekaa Rift Valley, which runs down into the lowlands of the Jordan Valley to the Dead Sea at Jericho. The southern end of this valley was a glacial refuge for wild plants and animals. Now the settlement of the Anunnaki was indicated by the above ideograms, which had a phonetic value of Garsag or Karsag, and appear to mean either the principal fenced enclosure or lofty fenced enclosure. Possibly both translations are valid. The Anunnaki were the Sumerian equivalents of the biblical angels. Only after they had disappeared from the Middle Eastern scene were they worshipped in a religious sense. And they were then so enveloped in supernatural trappings that their intrinsic, advanced and benevolent characteristics were swamped in a mass of pseudo-religious adulation. Christian O'Brien, CBE, in The Genius of the Few. Now the top ideogram there on the left, you can see 3 arrows in the center of that ideogram. And that is a clue that it was land and it was irrigated. Those 3 arrows being irrigation channels. Very important point and key point in this story. The perpetual snow of Mount Hermon as seen from Mount Bentor in Israel across the Bekaa Rift Valley. And this is the environments of the Rashaya Basin on page 304, Genius of the Few. Mount Hermon translates as the mountain of the chief and snowy mountain. Hermon cognate with Haram, which means sacred. The havens are the black dots on the map, legend below left, recorded in the Book of Enoch, which describe in detail Enoch's journey to meet the great Lord. Chapter 4, Genius of the Few. Outline contour map of the Rashaya Basin with speculative placements of structures mentioned in the Karsag epics. Features not to scale. Page 315, Genius of the Few. The great watercourse is shown running east-west from the dam wall overflow to the outlet in Wadi El Nira. That is a panoramic fisheye view across the flat Rashaya Basin looking west. And that was taken on our survey of the site in November 2009. Now what triggered my interest here was the very first images which we began to look at from Google, who had mapped the Earth, and this overhead here of the flooded basin actually shows the watercourse, which you can see very clearly running from left to right on this overhead photograph. Same again here, possible roundhouses remains north of the watercourse, and the roundhouses have now been destroyed, and part of the watercourse is being destroyed and filled in so that the locals can plant orchards. There again, looking back towards the dam and reservoir. Now, because this is all no longer maintained and looked after, then in the very wet times, in the winter months when the snow's melting on those Mount Hermon hills, you've got a lot of water coming in, so the site does get flooded most years. Eastern end of the watercourse now being filled in. You can just see the sand or the silt, yellow silt there, and the 2 banks of the watercourse. And this is the great watercourse running from left of the image right to the distance on the right, where it joins the Wadi Nirab at the headwaters of the River Jordan, with sections being filled in for orchards. So when we go up the River Jordan into the mountains where the Jordan waters come from, that's where we find the gods living all those years ago. Here we have the exposed section of rock cut watercourse looking west, being filled in with local building waste. And this is a common quote from Genesis 8 to 14, Genesis 2, 8 to 14. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And a river, I should have said watercourse, went out of Eden to water the garden. Hence it was parted sluices and became into 4 heads irrigation channels. So it's purely a situation where the Bible accurately records it, but they've got the important words wrong. And of course, names were probably used for rivers much later, hence the naming of the Tigris and Euphrates, etc. Overhead view of the valley below Ka'u. Site of the dam and reservoir described in detail by Enoch. The only feature which might possibly have provided an overflow or water diversion mechanism at the base of the original reservoir. Celestial abode of the gods. The celestial abode of the gods was Enel's great cedar and stone-built mountain house below and west of Mount Hermon, the meeting place of the divine council, where the Anunnaki based their headquarters, expanding to Baalbek at the head of the two rivers, which were the Litani and Orontes, not the Tigris and Euphrates. Settlements were set up first at Jericho by Enki, with eventually further dispersals to Anu, which was the same place as On or Cairo, Ebla, very important, Catalhayak, and Olympus in Cyprus. Karsag was still functioning as an education and training centre until the flooding catastrophe around 6500 BC. This is the secrets of Enoch, meeting the great Lord. Then the Lord said to Michael, "Take Enoch and strip him of his own clothes, anoint him with fine oil and dress him like ourselves." And Michael did as he was told. He stripped me of my clothes, rubbed me over with a wonderful oil like dew and a scent of myrrh. It shone like a sunbeam, and I looked at myself, and I was like one of the others. There was no difference, and all my fear and trembling left me. Then the Lord called one of his angels named Uriel, who was the most learned of them all, and said, "Bring out the books from my library and give Enoch a pen for speedy writing, and tell him what the books are about." And Uriel hurried and brought me the books, smelling myrrh, and handing me a pen. Now the sincerity of this account is quite remarkable. There are no heroics, no bombast, just an honest statement of his human frailty in the face of what must have been a most terrifying experience. The parallel Sumerian account shows that this building to which Enoch had been brought was the large, brilliant, cedarwood building on the high rock, the great house of Enel, the E-Kur. That quote is all from the Shining Ones. Site of Enel's great cedar-built house and enclosure on the high rock. Various descriptions from the ancient texts are clear in providing the evidence that we are looking here at the E-Kur mountain house, where the gods lived and divine decrees were given, kingship was exercised, and from which the cosmic waters of fertility flowed. Descriptions of the great cedar-built house within the sanctuary were the building of stone fireplaces, and where Adam and Eve spoke to the serpent, all help to support the Abraham thesis that this is the site of the Garden of Eden. Flat top hill overlooking north and south Rashar basins, southern Lebanon. Large stones showing masonry skills by the great house. Again, large stones, and these, we believe, were the original stonework from the original great house, now bulldozed to the edge of the site on which houses are being built by local Lebanese. Now looking down to the level basin from the great house, we've actually got a hillside well, middle left, and possible site for livestock buildings, roundhouses, pastures, orchards and plantations on a south-facing slope, which would have been very good for growing things and having animals. The hillside well, which you can't see very clearly on the previous photograph, but the hillside well above the livestock buildings. And the locals tell us that that water level in there never varies. It's been engineered and still works. And that's a view of the basin from a site of a possible livestock buildings. All we've got in vegetation now is looking back from the basin to the great house, top left, and possibly building of knowledge right, plus a single fig tree in the center there, and you can see how level the basin actually is. Remaining cedar grove, well watered by snowmelt water till midsummer. That's very important because you've got a supply of fresh water for 6 months of the year right into the growing season, absolutely critical for the kind of productivity we saw in the Garden of Eden. The location of the Garden of Eden is supported by texts from Ezekiel and Gilgamesh describing Lebanon and the cedar forest. Here are the images we have these images from very early Sumerian times, and we have the Most High, the Supreme Lord Anu, with statuettes from Tel Asmar. And what they did with these type of pictures was they had them size denoted seniority. So if you're most important, you're the biggest bloke there. And they were called the Anunnaki, not the Anunnaki, Anunnaki. Great gods foregather, death and life they determine, but of death they do not reveal. That's from a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Wonderful image here from H.M. Hergé, among a whole series of wonderful pictures which were created for the National Geographic magazine. So you hear about the Anunnaki in the 30s from people like Hergé and the archaeologists, but now we never hear about them from the serious archaeologists. Southern Lebanon location of Rashaya Aya, as it's called, basin, the site of Karsag, known much later as the Garden of Eden, in red. You can just see that red dot there beside the name Rashaya. At the center of the proximity to Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Damascus and Baalbek. And remember, Damascus is very important because it's one of the oldest cities in the world. Here is an image for Tyre, which is Phoenicia or Cana, or originally Canaan. This is very important because that promontory or extension there was created by Alexander the Great when he wanted to steal all the valuable goods from the people who lived at Tyre and had a massive worldwide trade. And those little islands you can see were originally quite a substantial landmass and have eroded away. And the main erosion took place from an explosion in Vesuvius in Sicily, the volcanoes in that end of the Mediterranean, a massive tidal wave that finished those islands off. We see the same thing with Caesarea and the same thing with Sidon. The original Sidon, Phoenicia, Canaan. The original well-equipped islands off the shore of both Tyre and Sidon have now eroded away, but originally allowed ships to dock on either side, depending on tide and weather, handling trade from all over the world. Druid history relates that missionaries from Sidon left for Britain in 3896. A galley from the area known in the early Bronze Age as Canaan or Tyrrhenian Sea, base for the people of God An to dominate world trade. Now we move to Jericho, the oldest town. Jericho location, view from the south, now 670 feet below sea level, then above sea level in the Rift Valley. Here is Tel al-Sultan, Kathleen Kenyon's excavation trench into the Tel on the middle right. Currently the first Holocene town from 9800 BC. View of the tower from the east showing both openings. You can see the openings at the bottom and the top. Note the lime plaster just above the lower opening. And lime plaster was absolutely crucial for a number of things which I'm going to come to. The brick-walled city of Jericho as it appeared when Joshua first saw it, part of the massive ancient rock-cut ditch, can be seen on the right encompassing the much larger earlier town. So we're looking there at Joshua's Jericho, and we're looking at the original Anunnaki Jericho, which is a much larger town with this massive rock-cut ditch. Now, the distinct advanced transitions at Jericho at the PPNA or the PPNB boundary, circa 9600 BC, there was suddenly a move to square or rectangular houses, manufacture of quality lime for plaster and correcting soil acidity. Lime plaster survives today on the Jericho Tower and house floors. A population rising to 300 people or more. Use of a 28 feet high tower for astronomical observations. This is research carried out by the Jerusalem University. 5. Dressed stonework and staircase, which would not have disgraced the best medieval castle. That's a quote from Kathleen Kenyon, British archaeologist who led the excavations. The entrance from top of the slope wall into the town. Now that was so that really the wall was built mainly as flood protection. So you went to the top of the slope wall and then went into the town. 6. Double entry bookkeeping tokens for food and other items delivered to the settlement. Wonderful research by a lady called Shmat Bassarat. Now the 27 feet wide by 9 feet deep ditch cut into solid bedrock outside the wall of the town for flood defence, similar to the Karsai watercourse, not far off, same dimensions. Very substantial wall around the town and use of local bitumen to waterproof it. As I said, it was constructed to prevent the settlement from being flooded at that low Rift Valley elevation. The town was built at a point where major trading routes met for salt and bitumen. Irrigated crops were successfully grown in the warmer climate in the sheltered and fertile Rift Valley, with reliable supplies of water and alluvial soil. The fig was first domesticated at Gilgal nearby and could only survive with human intervention. I go back to that sacred basket, and a lot of the plants could only survive or start again, if you like, with human intervention. And all this was fed by the remarkable Ain es Sultan spring, still running strongly today. Peter Tompkins, world specialist, domestication of crops. Domesticated crops which arrive here in Jericho was the work of thousands of years. Jericho earliest intentional domesticated seeds recorded. The calibrated dates of early Neolithic sites in the Jordan Valley and neighbouring hilly areas indicate that the large communities such as Jericho, Netiv Hagud and Gilgal were probably the result of the emergence of intentional cultivation during or immediately the end of the Younger Dryas. And we find that the earliest dating here is in Jericho itself. And this is Bar Joseph, O. Bar Joseph Peabody Museum, Department of Anthropology, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Top world specialists confirming this is where they find the first domesticated crops, where the Anunnaki were able to come and farm after or at the end of the Younger Dryas Ice Age. I've shown this because the whole world today lives and feeds on these important collagen food crops, on which 6.5 people depend. So it's rice, wheat, maize, sorghum, millet, barley. All those are the original domesticated crops left by our ancestors. Our ancestors feed us today. Now the difference between wild and domesticated seeds are completely different. Fat domesticated wheat grain between wild ones and an ancient relic. Domesticated maize. This caused mayhem because the two Dutch bioarchaeologists, Bottom Zeiss, in a lake bed, dated maize very close to Karsag at 7,500 BC. Other experts said it was impossible. Early evidence of maize has now been found in Africa and on Dartmoor, England, dated to 4200 BC. So maize was one of those basic founder crops. The arrival of plant and animal domestication at the boundary between the PPNA, pre-pottery Neolithic A, 9,500 BC, and the PP, pre-pottery Neolithic B. And so you have this sudden arrival between those dates. Plants. In the first instance, a unique ecology was required. In the Levantine corridor, wild barley, wild wheat, olives, pistachio, oak, and other plants and animals such as deer, foxes, and antelope had survived on what is termed as a glacial refuge. 16 basic acts of husbandry were required for a static community with supporting food and water to produce and distribute plant food harvest. That required detailed communal knowledge and skilled supervision within a large settlement or town. So these conditions that I'm talking about were totally unique, and they all arrived at the same time, and therefore they were brought there by an earlier civilization. 16 basic acts of husbandry. Number 1, drainage. Number 2, tillage. Minimum of preparation for pure stands. 3, soil fertility, organic matter, correcting acidity with lime, phosphate and potash, nitrogen cycle minerals. 4, raising and storing a new stock of domesticated seeds for each crop. 5, translocation, size of seed, planting and even germination. 6, competition, spacing and weed control, enough volume to be worthwhile. There's no point sowing seeds in fields if you actually could only get a very small percentage of those seeds germinating. 7, irrigation, supply of water through the growing season and application of it. Plant manipulation, which is pruning. Pest and disease control. Rotation of crops between different fields. Accommodation for animal stock. 11, pollination, manual with some crops, or availability of bees and insects, which of course weren't many of those to start with. 12, fencing or walling of crop area for protection. 13, harvesting, ratcheous strength and even ripening, seeds left clean. If you don't have the ratcheous strength, all the grain falls off the stalk and you can't harvest it. 14, storage of harvest. You have to have a grain store. You have to keep the rats and the mice and all the rest out of it. Looking after what was harvest. 15, skilled supervision at all times. 16, perhaps the most important at those times, law and order. In Sumer, the farmer was the most important member of the community. Next, the soldier, to ensure the food was produced safely and delivered by the artificers to the community. Public servants were at that bottom of the list. They came in last. Consequences of farming success. Year-round dietary availability from at least 10 staple crops, principally grains, 5 of which fixed nitrogen and could be grown in rotation. 10 of the found domesticated crops: emmer wheat, acorn wheat, barley, lentil, pea, bitter vetch, chickpea, linseed, figs, hemp. There was little reason why this diet of staple crops could not be supplemented by hunting, fishing and foraging, or buying and exchanging such products in the marketplace. Unavoidable conclusion. Overwhelming evidence of an advanced civilization in the creation of domesticated crops and animals, which arrived around the same time in the Levantine corridor around 9600 BC. The technology and seeds were taken around the world in the course of the next 2,000 years. That is a statement by one of the leading specialists on this subject, Bradley Lepper of the Ohio University. And this was done by these culture bearers whose name live on as angels, Engeli, E-N-G-E-Li, Engeli, which means lords of the cultivation, and watchers. Alternatively, Ab-Ka-Lu, which means the bright farmers from the enclosure. And see them all displayed beautifully in the Assyrian room at the British Museum. Further destructive cataclysms. The destruction of the Karsag settlement at around 6,500 BC through what was described as a 1,000-year storm coincides with the severe flooding of the Levantine corridor, Jericho, and the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, which fits in with the proposed dates for the 10-kilometre Buckle cometary impact in the Indian Ocean. This was big enough to create the severe flooding at the head of the Persian Gulf, together with massive rainfall. The power of this impact in the Indian Ocean is illustrated by the Fernambosey chevrons and the large boulder on the Indian coast below. And here we have Buckle crater, round about 6,500 BC, or it's never been properly dated, or we haven't been able to date it properly. And that's the red arrow in the middle of this map, as you can see, off the coast of Madagascar, but we find chevrons and evidence on both sides of the Indian Ocean, and it's believed it was a 10-kilometre diameter impact. The power of a tsunami. The Fernambosey chevrons, one of 4 on the southeast coast of Madagascar, is 600 feet high and 3 miles from the ocean. And the impact date is estimated at 6,500 BC. They would not have been created by wind, which some people have suggested. This is from The Secrets of the Ocean by Sandra Flaxley. That's what a tsunami looks like. Lovely image. Wouldn't want to be there. And that is a giant tsunami deposited this boulder at Tamil Nadu. I can't pronounce that word, but it's the east coast of India. And a lovely image. We're back to this wonderful man, Hergé, who drew these pictures, painted these pictures for National Geographic. And it's from the flood tablet, Epic of Gilgamesh. I looked at the weather, stillness had set in, and all mankind had turned to clay. Lovely, beautiful. So let's look at how often we have these impacts. And this is a list that I've got here, and I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see regularly in our history we've had these kind of problems, massive cometary debris impacts, right up to recently, last in 47, and then we've got the Tunguska event in 1908, an event in Brazil, very, very important. And these are contained within natural catastrophes during the Bronze Age civilizations, edited by Benny J. Pizer, Trevor Palmer, and Marquis Bailey. Now, these impact sites were interesting. They came from Malta before history, and people were beginning to think that when the pyramids were built at 2,400, they were forecasting major problems. And that's why we find the records of the previous catastrophe in the Great Pyramid, and why we have a whole spate of pyramid building around about 2,300. These are the 4 craters in Oman, Wabgar, Salvaradia, and you can see the detail there. Tunguska event in Siberia, massive explosion above the ground. An area the size of Belgium was devastated with the power of 1,000 Hiroshima atom bombs. Here is our top, or was our topped British astronomer and man who specialized in the problem of catastrophism, Professor Victor Klube. And what he identifies here is this: above and below the elliptic are shown thick and thin lines on the time scale. The Earth illustration shows typical nodal precession for the core of a torrid stream. And remember, torrid stream. In particular, when the Earth's orbit is intersected, note the arrows. The parts of the orbit respectively intersection epochs evidently occur around about 2200, 2000 BC, and circa 300 and 500 AD, implying a bombardment dust cycle of around 2.5 years, while the corresponding peripheral positions are below and above the elliptic. Okay, technical stuff, but you can look at that and see that we're due to have impacts from 2000, where we are now. Natural catastrophes during Bronze Age civilizations. There's a conference at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, which I went to, organised by the Society of Interdisciplinary Studies. Benny Pizer then summarises surveys made around 500 reports of late 3rd millennium BC civilization collapse and climate change, which shows a significant clustering around 2300, and that's what they built the pyramids because they were expecting it, and they knew enough about it to expect it and build the pyramids. Most sites in Europe, the Middle East, India, China, where civilization collapsed at this time, show clear signs of natural disasters. He concludes that only extraterrestrial bodies acting on terrestrial systems could produce the range of glaciological, geological, and archaeological features reported. And this is the conclusion of our top man, Professor Victor Klube. This question, as I've shown, is of deep historical and political significance, being intimately tied up with the origins of Christian doctrine and with the elitist desire to perpetuate anti-catastrophic views, along with its appropriately distorted cosmological setting. In view of the intellectual and cultural climate of irrationality which arises thereby, it is a moot point whether mankind will meet the challenge posed by this question before the next bout of catastrophic terror descends. Such a situation represents an intolerable risk to civilization. And that's from The Problem of Historical Catastrophism by Victor Klube. The second major catastrophe at 2354 BC ended the archaic Bronze Age civilization and the Golden Age. Sumer, as a former superb social organizing entity, ceased to exist. The kings and their advisors' roles were to deliver freedom, justice, leisure, and instruction to the people. Women were treated equally with men. And these are quotations from A Dawn of Conscience by James Breasted, which I can't resist adding at the end of this talk. Established is the man whose standard is righteousness, who walketh according to its way. That's the Grand Vizier, Pahute of Memphis. More acceptable is the virtue of the upright man than the ox of him that doeth iniquity. Instruction addressed to Prince Merikare by his Panther, an unknown pharaoh of Hierakonpolis, 23rd century BC. Righteousness is for eternity. It descendeth with him that doeth it unto the grave. His name is not effaced on earth, but he is remembered because of right. And there's a lovely quote from the eloquent peasant of Hierakonpolis, 23rd century BC. And the last one is, a man's virtue is his monument, but forgotten is the man of evil repute. And that's from an Egyptian tombstone about 22nd century BC. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Edmund.